Well, I don't know about you, but it seems a little bit suspect that I'm giving the message this morning. We're talking about going out and buying swords. Now, for those of you that don't get the joke, for those of you that don't know, I'm a blacksmith, right? I'm an amateur, and I make different things, but I mostly make knives and blades because they're simple, and I can sell them. And according to our passage this morning, Jesus said, quote, "Go out and buy a sword." With that in mind, if you'd like to visit my Etsy shop at etsy.com/shop/redbrickforge, I can get you set up with any and all bladed, sharp merchandise that you might need. And with that, let's close out.
Didn't know the message was a message.
It's a message of sorts. I mean, seriously though, our passage for this morning is a bit confusing. Here's Jesus, a guy who proclaimed forgiveness and love, a guy who called on his followers to live radically different lives. Lives characterized by peace and compassion, and a guy who died a criminal's death, non-violently, on a cross. And he's telling his followers that they need to go out and get swords. When I was a kid, I loved swords. Honestly, now that I'm a grown man, I still love swords. It's maybe a bit of an obsession. I blame movies like Lord of the Rings and Star Wars, right? There's just something so iconic about a long, sharp instrument of destruction. And it brings out the little warrior inside of a lot of us. Right, Michael? Some of the coolest heroes use swords. You got King Arthur, you got Obi-Wan Kenobi, kind of, like, that counts as a sword, I think, it's, whatever. You got Obi-Wan Kenobi, you got Aragorn, big old sword, you got Leonidas, and the Spartans, you got Tom Cruise and the Samurai, if you're into that kind of thing. And the list just goes on and on and on. Swords also, they require a lot of skill to use, which means that a person who can use one well has studied for a really long time and arguably deserves a lot of respect for their prowess, the things they're able to do. Swords have long been a symbol of what is right and good, the signifier of ideals that people strive for. When I was a kid, my best friend, whose name was Andy Charlacken, and we discovered that we could take metal pipes and we could hammer those down into these crude blades, right? And then we would proceed to take them out in the backyard and swing them at each other. And our moms must have panicked all the time. They must have been just panicked all the time. It was horrific. But in these moments, we were heroes. We were gladiators duking it out in the ring, or we were little mini warriors, getting ready to go into battle against the bad guys, training up to go into battle with bad guys. And I think that's kind of where a lot of our ideas about these weapons stop. They're grand, they're glorious, and the good guys use them. But the truth is, these things are actually kind of terrible. You got 2 to 4 feet of sharpened steel that is capable of inflicting awful, awful damage on any living creature, human beings included. Today, they may be symbols or art pieces because their usefulness has kind of outlived itself. But in Jesus' day and for much of human history, the sword was synonymous with violence, warfare, criminal activity, death, and destruction. The kind of weapon that we're talking about is most likely a Roman gladius. It's a short but sharp sword measuring about 2 feet in length. Awful, bloody wars were fought with these things, and thousands upon thousands of people met their death by them. A lot of blood was spilled using them as imperial Rome pushed her borders further and further out, quelling any and all rebellions as they cropped up. In addition to Roman soldiers, who, it could be argued, were the bad guys in this time and place, this type of sword was likely used by another, very different kind of person, zealots. Zealots were Jews who were looking to overthrow the Roman government that had been set up in Israel, and they were considered high-profile criminals in Rome's eyes, crucified and killed whenever they were caught spreading insurrection. Murderers, oppressors, criminals. Those are the main parties that use swords in this context. And Jesus, our peaceful, beautiful Jesus, tells his disciples that they need to go out and get swords during Passover, one of the most holy Jewish festivals in existence. They don't just need them, they need them. They need them so badly that Jesus says, if you don't have one, if you don't own one, go out and sell your shirt to get the money to buy one. Now, I'm not really sure what quality of blade you can get for the price of a used $10 shirt. But that's what Jesus says to do, right? There's an urgency here. There's a sense that it is an absolute necessity that Jesus' disciples, Jesus' followers, be armed and ready for a conflict. And that's where a lot of interpreters, preachers, and teachers tend to stop. That's not where I'm stopping, but that's where they tend to stop, right? The attitude almost seems to be like, that's it. Jesus said it. I believe it. We're not only allowed to go out and arm ourselves for conflict, we're commanded to do it. We've got to get the bad guys before they get us. All the earlier junk about loving your enemies and stuff, it must have been if they're not trying to hurt you. But something funny happens just 13 verses later in the same chapter. Jesus goes off to pray with some of his disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane. We all know this part of the story pretty well. He's out there sweating like drops of blood and praying until his heart is ready to burst. He's begging God to please let there be another way. Something easier, something less painful. His disciples fall asleep, leaving him utterly alone. And lo and behold, here comes Judas with a big crowd of people who are armed to the teeth. The disciples, who have been very dutiful and brought along their swords, say, Lord, should we attack them with our swords? Now, Luke doesn't point any fingers, but John does. And he says, Peter draws out his weapon and he attacks the servant of the high priest and he cuts off his ear. Now, I'm not sure if that's just like the clumsiest attack of all time, or if it's the most skilled attack of all time, but I'm not really sure how you cut off a person's ear without, killing them. Like it's kind of close to your head, I'm not sure, but that's what happens, right? And Jesus shouts, "That's enough! Those who live by the sword die by the sword." And he proceeds to take the dude's ear, put it back on. The disciples, they all scatter and run for the hills. And I imagine they would probably be pretty confused by this point. They've been following Jesus around for years, listening to the words he says, doing the things he tells them to do, and just trying their best to just get it right. They've been waiting their whole lives for a Messiah who is going to come and fix all this junk that Israel has found themselves in. They're looking for a king who's going to overthrow Rome and bring the people back to God. And Jesus shows up and says, "Here I am. I am the guy." When he tells them, "Hey, go get swords." When he tells them, "Hey, go get swords," I have to imagine that they experience a little bit of excitement. Like, this is the moment they've been waiting for. The king has arrived, and he is going to mess his enemies up. And then he yells at them for doing the exact thing they thought they were supposed to do. And he heals his enemy right before being dragged away and killed in one of the most horrific ways possible, all the while praying for his enemies. So then what are we looking at? Given all that information, I think we could be forgiven for asking, what the heck is the deal? We're back to asking the question that I think we often ask, which is, did Jesus really mean what he said? What exactly did he mean by what he said? The Bible is so full of these twists and turns that we never saw coming, and sometimes we end up out in a cornfield thinking that it's the road, because we aren't always great at thinking about context and the ways that passages fit together as a whole. The answer, it turns out, is right there in the passage. In Luke 22:36, Jesus tells his disciples to go out and buy a sword, and in verse 37 he says, "For I tell you, what was written must be fulfilled in me." And then he quotes Isaiah 53:12 and says, "And he was counted among the lawless," followed up by, "Yes, what is written about me is coming to its fulfillment." With a snap of his fingers, Jesus has unlocked the meaning behind his own words. The Bible may be full of these twists and turns, but it also usually beats us to it when it comes to divining meaning. Jesus' followers need to be armed so the words of Isaiah could be fulfilled, so that Jesus could be counted among lawless people, even though he had never done a single thing wrong. Isaiah 53 is one of the most classic messianic passages in all of Old Testament literature, and it details just the kind of suffering that the Messiah will undergo as he carries out salvation for his people. It also completely opens up our understanding of Jesus' words in Luke 22, and I wanted to paraphrase it so I didn't have to give it all to you in full, but I didn't think I could do it justice. So I'm just going to read it. It goes like this. "Who has believed what we have heard, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him, like a young plant and like a root out of dry ground. He didn't have an impressive form or majesty that we should look at him, no appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of suffering who knew what sickness was. He was like someone people turned away from. He was despised, and we didn't value him. Yet he himself bore our sickness. He carried our pain. But we in turn regarded him struck down by God and afflicted. He was pierced because of our rebellion. He was crushed because of our iniquities. Punishment for our peace was on him. And we are healed by his wounds. We all went astray like sheep. We've all turned to our own ways, and the Lord has punished him for the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, but he didn't open up his mouth. Like a lamb led to the slaughter, and like a sheep silent before her shearers, he did not open his mouth. He was taken away because of oppression and judgment, and who considered his fate? For he was cut off from the land of the living. He was struck because of my people's rebellion. He was assigned a grave with the wicked, but he was with a rich man at his death, because he had done no violence and had not spoken deceitfully. Yet the Lord was pleased to crush him severely. When you make him a guilt offering, he will see his seed. He will prolong his days, and by his hand the Lord's pleasure will be accomplished. After his anguish, he will see light and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will carry their iniquities. Therefore, I will give him the many as a portion, and he will receive the mighty as a spoil, because he willingly submitted himself to death and was counted among the lawless. yet he bore the sin of many and interceded for the rebels. See, Jesus did come to overthrow oppression. He came to overthrow the powers that be in one of the most epic and powerful ways possible, but he didn't come to do it in the way that anyone expected. The kingdom is upside down, it turns out. The method is backward. Everybody wants to be the big dog on top of the pile, but Jesus tells his disciples and us vicariously that if you want to be great in the kingdom of God, you've got to get humble. If you want to be honored, you've got to eat a lot of everybody else's junk. If you want to be first, you have to be last, and last he was. The lastest that has ever lived, and because of it, the greatest. He poured out his life unto death, was counted as the worst of sinners, and killed as though he were, even though he had done nothing wrong. But by the grace of God, he rose up from out of the grave 3 days later, and with that resurrection, he laid claim to salvation for every single one of our souls. Hallelujah. The disciples, like many of us maybe, take the command too literally, and they proceed to produce 2 swords. Meaning that they're already carrying weapons. Like, they've never heard a single thing Jesus has told them about peace or loving their enemies. Jesus says, that's enough. I don't know if it was an exasperated enough, like some translations have it, or if it was a serious enough. Like, yeah, that'll be enough to fulfill the prophecy. Or if it was just a quiet, resigned enough. Like he's just so disappointed that they've missed it when he has laid it out so clearly and beautifully. What I do know is that the disciples missed the point, and as a result, they missed the blessing of everything that was happening until a resurrected Jesus showed up and spelled it out for them like a bunch of 5-year-olds. So when it really comes down to it, our verse for the morning, this verse isn't actually about swords at all. The weapon is not the point. The Savior is. The King has come. He is here, and with him has come the greatest kingdom ever seen or known. It is beautiful, and it is backward, and we are all, each and every one of us, welcomed into it with open arms. May you find beauty in that truth. May the release of all your cares and worries, your securities and your defenses, even your very self, allow you to be sustained by the very one who has secured salvation for your soul. The very one who loves you and provides for you more deeply than you ever know. Let's pray. Dear God, we owe you a lot. We thank you for that. You have poured out grace in so many ways, and you continue to pour out grace every single day. I feel like that's just striking me so much today, so much right now. Your grace is poured out so often in our lives. Thank you for your salvation. Thank you for coming to die as a sinner, even though you weren't one. Thank you that you didn't stay dead. Thank you that because of that, we get a chance to be with you. And in the meantime, we get a chance to lay aside all the things that hold us down.